Welcome to BlackBerry Biz Blog video series. This one's on BlackBerry Web Services, or BWS as it's commonly known. My name is Jeff Bentley. I'm a senior enterprise developer with BlackBerry, helping customers to build applications for our platform and for non-BlackBerry devices, leveraging our BlackBerry Enterprise Service 10 for cross-platform capabilities and manageability. I'll be joined later by a teammate, Swale Nunez, who will show you how to bolt things together that I'll speak to at the beginning and build a sample program, kind of a hello world, to either list some users or show your server capabilities or users on servers. And then I'll come back and I'll kind of close out with kind of a summation and show you some resources that you can use, as well as some contact information as well. So with that, we're going to get started. I'll talk about some BES automation, getting started. Again, as I mentioned, we'll have a couple of demos. The demo that I'll go through will be installing your certificate that's required for authentication, as well as the creation of the proxy files. And Swale will come in and show you that sample that bolts things together and shows you how to create that, hello world sample that lists some users. And then I'll come back and talk about resources and kind of a summary. So BES automation, it's been an evolution for sure. We had some capabilities starting way back with the BES 1.0 or BlackBerry Enterprise Server. It's now called BlackBerry Enterprise Service for version 10. But way back in 1.0, we came out with something that was a command line tool set that you required to open a command prompt, execute a couple of commands and get some information back. That was a very basic extract, update, and add capabilities. The resulting information either came back in the command prompt that you had open, or you could pipe the information to a standard out or a standard error. For those that are familiar with those terms and capabilities, it gave you the ability to script something to do some analysis. The output was very basic indeed, in that every line had its own identifier, but those identifiers could be reused in certain situations, so they weren't necessarily a return code or a great identifier. It required you to actually look on the line or analyze further along the line for information. A lot of companies had leveraged the BRK, and some do today as well, for extracting information, running some reports that are canned reports that the BRK handles. But the BRK is still supported today in BES 5 as well as BES 10. When we introduced BES 5 or BlackBerry Enterprise Server 5 way back in 2009, we came out with what was called the BAA or BlackBerry Administrative APIs. It allows you to do almost all the user administration using either a Java or .NET programming language to make your calls directly in to add users, modify users, that type of thing. The Java implementation was the preeminent language that we wrote it for. The proxy that we created for .NET was a little kludgy and cumbersome. And by that, I mean you had to set a property. Let's just say you're searching for a person or persons via email address. And then you had to set another property with a true-false Boolean to say that you had set the previous property. So while it worked, again, it was a little cumbersome. Some customers embraced it, especially when they had written a number of procedures and processes against the BRK. This was a step forward, so they took advantage of that. But it wasn't as easy as what they thought it was going to be using .NET, and that was predominantly the big request we had. In 5.0.3 of BlackBerry Enterprise Server, we introduced BWS, or BlackBerry Web Services. It does allow for all user administration. It is web services based, as the name implies. And we have customers using Java, .NET, and PowerShell as the languages with which to facilitate their applications, leveraging BWS. You can see we kind of have the upward trending evolution from lower left to upper right, and BWS is still supported, not necessarily still, in BlackBerry Enterprise Service 10. At BlackBerry, we leverage the BWS for portals to allow self-administration for users to put themselves on beta programs, move servers, get into alpha programs. The portal was written by a gentleman internal to BlackBerry who had no .NET experience and no web services. But he was one of the ones that was receiving the calls from the numbers of thousands of BlackBerry users who had received new phones and needed access to their email, need to get enterprise activation passwords, need to get device passwords reset, those types of things. So he took it upon himself, and within a month, he learned not only Visual Basic language, but he also learned the BWS capabilities and wrote the first portal. And while it wasn't the be-all to end-all, it was a great tool for us in the field to be able to get our devices and manage them ourselves versus opening a ticket or potentially who you knew you made a call. So it is a very easy thing to consume these web services. .NET and PowerShell use the same underlying pinnings from a certificate and a proxy. Java uses its own, obviously, from that perspective. So the abilities, this could be either does and doesn't do, can, can't do, however you want to divide the columns up. But BlackBerry Web Services does user administration. That's the key point. You can do creation, listing, modify, delete of the user. You have capabilities and search arguments for listing, either by email address, by PIN, by last name, by BES server, all of the things that you would try and search by, you have those capabilities. Modifying, not only can you modify the profile information, and the profile being the person, but you can modify the attributes as well. So what policies they have, what software configurations they have, what email profile is assigned, and so on. Delete stands onto itself, what you can do there. You can set an enterprise activation password, as what we do in our portal. You can set the device password, wipe the device, suspend the device, all the things that you can do through the BlackBerry Administration Console, or BAS, we call it, BAS Console, you can do with BWS. What it doesn't do is it doesn't do server administration. So I can't modify my server, I can't change the high availability in a BES 5 environment, so I can't switch the active to passive and backwards. I can't do anything with IT policies. I can't modify them, create them, or delete them. I can't do anything with software configurations. Again, it's user administration. It doesn't inherently do reporting, but you can use the listing capabilities to get information out with which then could be used for input to other reports or some analysis. So I could list all users on a BES server. I could list all users in my domain. Along with that, I could then make subsequent calls to get what policies have been used, find any unused policies that way, those types of things. Some customers chose way back in the early days of BES 3, BES 4, and so on, of doing direct SQL queries. While that's not BWS related, a lot of customers have leveraged direct SQL queries with their BWS capabilities to marry the two and make a great provisioning tool to either onboard or offboard a person as far as whether they do or don't have a BlackBerry, or now with BES 10, whether they do or they don't have a managed device, whether that be a BlackBerry, an iPhone, or an Android. We don't provide SQL schemas. BlackBerry has never done that. A lot of customers have just reverse engineered their understanding of the tables and the foreign keys and then make their appropriate SQL queries. Some customers, their database analysts don't want people doing SQL queries in there for fear of, hindering or impeding performance of a BES. I can tell you from experience that's not a large issue or big deal, having done this myself at a previous employment, but a lot of customers do that, the SQL queries, to get faster response and then do their own analysis on the data afterwards. So getting started, you need to understand your development options, where your skill sets lie. .NET, either C# or VB, Java or PowerShell. That would be the order currently today of use cases that we have by customers. Predominantly it's C#, but it is .NET first, then Java, then PowerShell. There's a great KB article, which I'll show in a second, and the link will be provided at the end as well. It goes over the kind of ins and outs, what you need, prereqs of getting started, and then it has 2 sample applications attached at the bottom, as you can see. And when we open up the .NET sample, you'll see that there's 3 files in there. The standard out is just output from a test that got included in there. The program CS is C# Hello World basic sample that shows you how to authenticate and then pass the credentials and make a call to get a user. And then the PDF file is the information that kind of gets you going and gives you the explicit commands on how to get your certificate installed, as well as getting your proxy file set up. So with that, I'm going to jump out here and show you the file as I have downloaded it. It shows the exact same files that are in here. They are fairly old, but nothing has changed. So everything is backwards and forwards compatible within the environment. So you could create your automation against BES 503 or higher using BWS, and then simply change the credentials in the URL and point to a BlackBerry Enterprise Service 10 infrastructure, and the calls will still work. You won't have access to any of the newer calls that we may have exposed because your proxy file is being referenced from what was built off of a 5.x BES, but it'll work. You can also build it against BES 10 and use it against a BES 5 as long as you don't make a call that's only supported in BES 10. That just stands to reason. So with that, I will open my Internet Explorer here to that page. And here's the article. And it talked about, you need 503, should really be updated to 503 or higher. Talks about, what it supports, the key differences. There are 2 main WSDLs. One is BWS, the other is BWS Util, as I'm pointing to with my mouse. The BWS is a single WSDL that contains all methods, as you can read there, and it exposes everything that requires authentication. BWS Util has 5 methods in it, and those are used to create your authentication and pass the credentials that obviously don't require authentication in order to get started. They each contain metadata that's required to or specific to locale, client version, and such. And we talk about the development platform, so either .NET 2.0 or higher. At the time of writing this was 3. I'm currently running 4.5. The 2 versions of Apache that we support. And then here we have the 2 samples that were referenced in that picture I showed. The Adobe file, as mentioned, talks about setting up. The Java one is identical to show you how to set that up. It talks about requirements, so I need at least a 503 or higher. I need a framework of this or higher. How to install my certificate and how to generate my proxy. And gives great detail on that. So I'm going back to my slides here. So as mentioned, the util, its initial setup of authentication, the BAS URL that is pointed here where my cursor is, that will be required from your BES administrator for logging into the BAS or the BlackBerry Administration Service console. And the BWS below requires the same BAS URL. And then you can see the following part of the URL to go to the appropriate WSDL. And those will be referenced not only to build your proxy, but also in your application, and Swale will show that as well. So certificates, they're required for use of both URLs. So you need to do that as step 1. .NET, the easiest thing is to use Internet Explorer, navigate to the administration console. Once you're prompted with your certificate, install it into the trusted, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then you're good to go from there on out of anything you do with .NET or PowerShell. Java, the recommended way is to use Internet Explorer to navigate to the BAS or the BlackBerry Administration Console, export that certificate and add it to your own key store that you use for Java. That's outlined in that PDF file. I'll just be showing .NET and Swale will just be showing a .NET sample as well. And the proxy, there are really two ways of creating this proxy. It contains both URLs, so you only have one file to reference. .NET, we're going to use the WSDL.exe tool, and that's the part that I will show. In Java, we will show the, or you can use either the Apache CXF version, which is the WSDL 2 Java, or you can use the wsimport for the JAX version of Apache. Authentication, there are two methods, and you need to understand this. Active Directory, which allows BAS, or the BlackBerry Administration Service, to pass it through to Active Directory using the user ID, password, and domain, and then get back either a true, false, success, failure on whether those credentials were good or not, and they'll get passed back to your call through the appropriate BWS util call that you made. Or you can use BlackBerry Administration Service credentials, which is local to the BlackBerry SQL database, and that's just a user ID and password. You'll get either one of these from your BES administrator, or if you're the BES person, you can choose to set up whichever way you want. And it uses the BWS util WSDL for authentication. So one of those five methods that are in that in order to get authenticated before you make any other call. And then that information is applied to some metadata for all future calls as we make them. So getting started, your steps, you need to decide on a development platform. So if you're better experienced in Java, then by all means choose that. If you're a .NET shop, then go that route. Or if you really want to do some scripting without having a development environment and the cost of doing .NET and Visual Studio, then go PowerShell. You need the URL for logging into the BAS. So you'll need to contact your BES administrator, or if you're that person as well, you can save yourself a step. You need to install the certificate. The easiest way that I know of for .NET is to simply log in, as well as Java. Log into the BAS, which will prompt you about a certificate, and then you can do the appropriate steps based on the development language that you're choosing. And create a proxy stub. So therefore you use a command line parameter that uses a lot of parameters to create this proxy step. So with that, I'm going to give my demo on getting access. So I'm going to navigate to our lab console. You'll see I have a certificate issue that Internet Explorer is kind of barking with. So I'll continue to the site. And before I get to actually working with the certificate, this is the login for BlackBerry Administration Service console. And I would highly recommend for testing that whatever credentials you get from your BES administrator, that you at least attempt to try and log in first. So if it's Active Directory, I would put the username, or password, domain, and Active Directory, and actually log in and see what I get back as far as capabilities, because it is a managed site. You can give policies and permissions as to how granular the credentials you'll have has access to manage users. It's easier to troubleshoot here that you can see response versus spending potentially hours in your code trying to figure out why something's not working, why you can't add an IT policy, or why you can't modify a certain property of a user. You may not have been given access to do that by whomever set up the credentials for your access. With that being said, another avenue of importance is using this to troubleshoot if your application was working and all of a sudden it stops and you suspect something changed, but you know it wasn't your code. Come here and log in to make sure you can still authenticate. While that sounds intuitive or obvious, we have had a number of customers make a call into BlackBerry that swear nothing was changed and their code is working, but there's that delineation between the developer and the support person and the administrator, or potentially the Active Directory person, who changed permissions, or potentially the password changed on that ID object, and the developer's program no longer works, but to them they made no changes. If they logged in through this console, they would see their authentication has problems or they no longer have access to what they used to. They can then fix it quicker than trying to troubleshoot through their code. It's not always intuitively obvious in your code to look and go, oh, this is an authentication issue. You're probably going to troubleshoot your code first for an hour or so and get frustrated. So with that being said, I'm going to install my certificate and I'll go through the wizard that's provided. I'm not going to allow it to programmatically select. I want the trusted store or the trusted root store. So I'm going to choose that, finish, follow through a bunch of clicks, and now I've installed the certificate. So to prove that, I'll close out Internet Explorer. I will reopen it, and I will go back to, hopefully you're not getting dizzy while you follow my clicks here. I will go back to my console, and I'm good to go. I no longer have a certificate issue. With that being said, we now need to do our proxy or create the proxy file. As mentioned, it's in an SDK folder that I mentioned way back when I talked about the Adobe file, all the way down to the bin file. And if I scroll down quickly, you'll see that the WSDL.exe utility is here. This is all outlined in that Adobe file, with which I had shown, and this is here, and it talked about if you're using Studio 2008 or 10 or 13, you can find it in this location. So I'm going to open my command prompt and get to the bottom, and you can see it's a fairly lengthy command, WSDL.exe, some properties that are outlined in that Adobe file. I'm going to create this file /out BWS proxy CS. Then the next two parameters are the actual WSDLs of the BWS and BWS util. Everything looks the same with the exception of this util part here on the second one. As you can see, here's the URL to our BlackBerry Administration Service console or BAS console. You'll note here that I have a port of 444. That's only because we chose to install our BAS console on a different port than the default, which is 443. If yours is installed on the default port, you do not need to specify the port. In our lab, 443 was being leveraged for something else, so we chose to install it as that. So once I have that certificate installed and I'm connected to our network, obviously, I can make this call. It takes a couple of minutes to do, so I'll try and fill some dead space here. And then when I'm done, I'll end up with a file that I can then include. In my case, it'll be a C# file as my proxy within my application that Swale will show how to, import that and include it into his application to do his, hello world or his, basic listing for users. I was kind of hoping this would have been done by now, so we'll just wait a second or two more for it to create the file. I have chosen to put no additional information on the /out for the BWS or BWS proxy.cs. So it will create it right in the folder that I'm in, which is that Microsoft SDKs, window 7.0, and so on. So there. So now I'll do a dir BWS ***, and I guess I need to enter the right command. And you can see that the file was created here today at 10:37 a.m. And there it is, the file that I created. I would simply copy that to my project file within my .NET application, and I would be good to go. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Swale, who's going to show you how to take these pieces that I've started building for you, put them together, and build a sample application that will list users or get users from a server and give you some ins and outs and some tips. So with that, Swale, over to you.
Welcome to the BlackBerry Web Services BWS demo. My name is Swale Nunes. I am a senior wireless application architect here at BlackBerry. Within this short video, I'll demonstrate how to quickly set up a Windows application in Visual Studio to utilize your newly generated proxy file. This will allow access to BWS for both BlackBerry Device Service, BDS, and Universal Device Service, UDS. At the end of the video, we should have made a successful BWS request that returns a list of users on your BES. let's get started. Let's go ahead and launch Visual Studio. It is assumed that you are somewhat familiar with the Visual Studio IDE. The version I'm currently running is Visual Studio 2010 Professional. We'll create a new project by clicking File, New Project. Under your list of installed templates, select Windows under the Visual C# category. This will be a Windows Forms application, so be sure to make that selection. Let's rename the project to something a bit more relevant. I'm okay with the default location. Click OK. Now that we have a working template as our base, let's start by adding our previously generated proxy file. We'll do this by right-clicking on the project name in the Solution Explorer, go to Add, and select an existing item. Locate your generated proxy file using the Windows Explorer window. Click Add. This project will require some additional references and using directive. So let's go ahead and add we'll do this by right-clicking on references and add a reference. Under the .NET tab, scroll to system.web.service and click OK. Next, we'll open the program.cs file and add an additional using directive. These references and using directive will help prevent compiler errors later. Because all the code needed for our demo was pre-written and supplied in the program.cs in the zip file you previously downloaded, let's replace the contents of the newly created program.cs with the one from the sample zip file. Now that we've copied over the code, let's go ahead and update the authentication credentials where necessary. These credentials will be for your specific BlackBerry Administration Service, BAS. Let's start off with the authenticator name, switching that from BlackBerry Administration Service to Active Directory. In the setup function, we'll need to update the BAS URL, username, and BAS password as well. Let's find all references for the setup. I'll go ahead and copy over my BAS URL. I've created a username and password for demo purposes. It is important to specify the domain in your request. So in the get encoded username, we'll write a simple if statement that verifies the authenticator as Active Directory, and if it is, we'll set the domain to ATT Lab. Again, this is specific to my particular BES. We should now have a fully functional application. In the Solution Explorer, right-click on the project name and click Clean. It should say Clean succeeded at the bottom of your screen. Right-click on the project name again and build a project. This too should return a success. If we run the application, the return users will appear within the console window, but let's take it a step further and create a simple UI. We'll start off by opening our form 1.cs design file. From the toolbox, Under Common Controls, drag both a button and a label. Position your controls to your liking. Assign a name for the controls in their respective properties. Then set the modifier for your label to public. The text on the Get User button will be Get User. Now the label properties. Set the text as blank. Label users. We also want to set the modifiers public. That way we'll be able to access it from external files. Let's go a step further and set the auto size to false and just specify a height and width for our label. Add a border style of fixed 3D. Let's add some on-click functionality to the button by double-clicking on it and make a call to the Get Users function. In your program class, initialize an instance of your form. Let's now move to the Get Users function and write code to access your label and populate it. We can now comment out the get user call from the main function as well as the get system info. That way we're not making multiple calls for the same function. We'll need to add code we deleted earlier to launch the UI component of the app. The UI and logic to populate it is now complete and ready for testing. Right-click on a project name in the Solution Explorer and build the application again. After a successful build, run the application by clicking the Start Debugging green arrow at the top of the screen. Now go ahead and click your Get Users button. Voila! Congratulations! There you have it, a successful request and response from BWS. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching.
Welcome back. Thanks, Wally. Great sample. Hoping people can see how easy it is to create something, to leverage BWS, get the proxy, get their code working, get the authentication, and some of the tips that you've pointed out. From a resources perspective, we have that KB article that I mentioned. It's a great blog post to get you going, figure out how to get started, referencing the information that I and Swally have provided here in this little video. The other part we'd like to point you to is our docsblackberry.com BWS, as far as the release notes, getting started, the API reference, the code samples. So it does show everything from soup to nuts. There are more code samples other than the two that I referenced in the KB article. Their API reference is going to be your go-to place for referencing how to leverage the methods that are exposed in the web services. Depending on your language, whether it's Java or .NET, if it's Java, then the classes will suit you great. The .NET world or PowerShell, you may want to go to just the BWS and the BWS util class. It more identifies with the .NET naming conventions and referencing of the WSDLs versus the explicit classes that would be used for Java. With that being said, please follow us at BlackBerry for Biz on Twitter. stay tuned to the bizblog.blackberry.com. And for contact information, you have, myself, Jeff Bentley at the top, my Twitter handle, and Swale, his email address and his Twitter handle as well. And with that, we'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your day to view this video on BlackBerry Web Services, and hoping that this kind of interests you or gets you moving along in the right direction to automate your provisioning capabilities for the BlackBerry infrastructure. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either one of us, and have a great day. Thank you.